Welcome, ladies and gentlemen, to our new Forbes digital TV channel, Forbes 15, with the new episode of Political Economy. My name is Niklas Hintermeyer. I'm a journalist of the German-speaking issue of Forbes, and I'm very pleased to welcome my guest today is Loretta Napoleoni. She's an investigative journalist and a political commentator and analyst, and also a book author. She's an expert on terrorist financing, rogue economies, and like in general, jihadist terrorist groups in Syria and also in Iraq. So welcome and thank you for your time, Loretta Napoleoni.
Thank you for inviting me.
Thank you. So we talked before, you're now based like in Montana, like in the United States, and you said there are almost no coronavirus infections and no infections with this pandemic. But could you also describe a little bit the situation, what's going on with restrictions or measures in the United States, in your town, so to say now, and also when you look to Italy, to your home country, and especially like Rome?
Well, here, this is a valley west of Montana. We're really close to the Canadian border. And basically what the governor has done shelter in place right at the beginning. So about 4 to 5 weeks ago. So relatively speaking, this is a safe place because the number of people living here is low, it's about 70,000. And by blocking any movement because of the shelter in place, the virus has been contained. So we really had very, very few cases and only 2 or 3 deaths. Now, the rest of the US is a different, of course, it's a different situation, especially New York, so the East Coast and the West Coast. But that was a normal that was going to happen, something like that, because of the density of population. See, at the center of the US, places like Montana, Wyoming, North Dakota, so in the West and also parts of the Midwest, there's a lot of space, so there's not a high density of population. So the contagious, of course, can stay under control. Now, in Italy, it's interesting actually what has happened because I took one of the last flights from Milan to New York, and I was in all the places where there's been very high contagion. And I got here around the 21st of February, and there was no control, nothing. So, I mean, I could actually have been one of the people that brought the contagion here, but that I think was a big mistake. I mean, not only in the US, but I would say everywhere in the world, there's not been a control in terms of importation of the virus. But we'll see what's happening now because they're reopening the economy. Here we're at phase 2. So restaurants are not open yet, but you can go into a restaurant and get a takeaway. Next week they should reopen the restaurants and movie theaters, 15th of May also. So we'll see what's happened when we reopen the economy.
Let's talk about Italy and, so to say, like the kickstart for your investigations about terrorist financing. You met at the beginning of the 90s ex-members of the Red Brigade, of the Marxist terrorist group that was responsible for terrorist attacks like in Italy in the 70s and 80s. You talked and get to know their structures, like in financial terms, and also like what they wanted, so to say. And there was, so to say, like the kickstart for your investigations about terrorist financing. How did you approach, like in the first place, this very, very broad topic?
Well, to be honest, it happened by chance that I ended up studying and working on the field of terrorism because I had a childhood friend who became a member of the Red Brigades, and then when they decided to declare the end of the armed struggle, which is in 1992, what is called the Battaglia della Libertà, they made a list of people with whom they would talk about their experiences. See, the red brigades never spoke with anybody, even with their lawyers, until 1992. So, and she mentioned that she would like to talk to me. I think I was chosen because I had lived abroad since 1979, so I had no connection with any of the parties. So I was perceived as a sort of impartial individual to to basically tell their story to the rest of the world. So this is how I started, and because I am an economist, and at that time I was working in the city of London, so I quit my job. When I was talking to them about what did they do um, during their activity, during their terrorist activity, I discovered that actually money played a very big role. And this is when I decided to investigate that side. So I was not any longer interested in their political motivation, ideology, why did they did it, but I looked at how they funded themselves. And I applied to that research all the instruments of my profession, which was to work in finance in the city of London. So I really invented the whole thing step by step, but it worked.
You also you came up with a very interesting number, like in 2000, like so before the terrorist attacks of 9/11. You said like the overall economy composed by crime, terrorism, and the legal economy itself was about 1.5 trillion US dollars. So very like a huge amount, of course. Are there any figures for today?
Well, it's very difficult. I mean, at that time, it took a long time to actually do that kind of calculation. And I would say that today, that economy is possibly much bigger. We don't know exactly what's the terrorist component and what's the criminal component, because what has happened since 9/11, we've seen a progressive criminalization of armed organization. So, I mean, take for example, Al Qaeda in the Maghreb. It was formed in 2003 by a group of smugglers from Algeria, who originally had escaped Algeria after the coup, the military coup. They were Islamists. They liked the idea to be jihadists also, but in reality, they were smugglers and simple criminals. They used the money of the first major kidnapping of Europeans, which was about 6 million euros, to form Al Qaeda in the Maghreb. So to me, Al Qaeda in the Maghreb is not in the same category of the Red Brigades. You can't possibly say that. It's not even in the same category, I would say, of Al Qaeda, the historical Al Qaeda. So that is very difficult today. I mean, Boko Haram, same story. It's very difficult today to draw a line, as it was possible until 9/11, between simple criminality and jihadism. So that's why I say that division that I did, so 1/3 was actually the criminal economy, and 1/3 was the terrorist economy, and then 1/3 was the illegal economy, so tax evasion, all stuff. Today is very, very difficult to draw the line. But the total, which is the most important part of it, so the total volume definitely is much higher.
Let's stay like at the jihadist groups, and like especially like when it comes to the IS in Syria and in Iraq. You said like very, very high amount they're gonna fund themselves, or they're funding themselves by human trafficking and kidnapping, and also of course with oil smuggling. My two questions would be, how do they organize to receive this money, so to say, and with whom do they collaborate?
Well, I mean, the Islamic State, of course, we're not talking about today. because I mean today the Islamic State has changed dramatically. It's a very small group, is scattered around certain areas of Iraq and Syria. But if we want to talk about at the peak of the Islamic State, the Caliphate, the collection of money took place through a traditional channel. I mean, the same channel that we use in our countries through a taxation system. I mean, the Islamic State was very good at building a sort of bureaucracy, an infrastructure, let's say, that was run by the bureaucracy. It mimic very much, the nation state. So the way that the money were gathered was actually mostly very, very legal, meaning, they had the system, and that system was in place. I would say that today the Islamic State as such doesn't exist anymore. It's probably revert to small gangs. Is also very much involved, I would say, with criminal activities and illegal activities, because I mean that's natural. That once you lose that status, and also once you lose the control of the territory. That's the train. Does it bother you?
Right, yeah.
Yeah.
I think for now it's okay. We can continue.
Well, it's gonna come right.
I'm-
Let's wait.
We could stop for 1 second.
So yes, but you can come. Right.
Okay, with a like a short interruption with the train in the background, we talked about the Islamic State, like in Syria. But I would also like to ask you, like, it was defeated mainly, of course, the IS, like in Syria and Iraq, but like there were also some warnings from the United Nations that because of the coronavirus pandemic and the situation in Syria, like they could rise again to a certain amount, like the IS. Do you still think that's over, so to say, or like maybe other groups gonna emerge and could be even stronger out of this vacuum?
Well, yeah, absolutely. I mean, the Islamic State is just one mutation of the same phenomenon. So we got before we got Tuaid al-Jihad of al-Zarqawi, then we got the Islamic State in Iraq, then we got the Islamic State, then we got the Caliphate. So the name is irrelevant, to be honest. The key issue is the fact that that area has been highly destabilized, and we have not been able to lead the transition into a democracy. So until this happens, unfortunately, the Islamic State will come back with different reincarnations. So we will continue to have a jihadist movement, which of course will present itself as a sort of nationalistic movement, wanted to build a nation state. Of course, the Sunni nation state versus the Shia. But at the end of the day, it's still terrorism. I mean, it's still violence. So at the moment, the situation is under control, but it can reflare any moment. Now, the coronavirus, I don't think will have a big impact. Yes, maybe the coronavirus will kill some members, but at the end of the day, it's not a pandemic that is going to stop that process of reincarnation. We'll have to wait and see, but I'm highly pessimistic, especially with the fact that now we have the presence of Russia, which is very, very strong. We also have the presence of Turkey. So we're back in a situation where we have a war by proxy in highly destabilized areas.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, like especially like in the northeast around Idlib. Yeah. I would like to talk about another topic. It's the parallel economy that was created by armed organizations after the Second World War. You described three phases, and I would like to talk about the third phase, about globalization. It was a great change for these armed organizations, terrorist organizations. You also said like the money they made flowed like to a huge amount in the United States at that time, because most of the currency was denominated like in US dollars.
Yeah.
Is this still the case?
No, it's not the case at all. The majority of the money laundering activity is not taking place in the U.S. anymore because of the Patriot Act. Now, of course, there is money laundering in the U.S. Through the U.S. Tax havens, like Delaware, for example. But when we talk about terrorist financing, when we talk about recycling of the cocaine or heroin trade for the cartel, no, I would say that most of this activity since 2001, 2002, so since the introduction of the Patriot Act, has gone through Europe. So the euro has benefited tremendously through this kind of activity. The reason also why it went through Europe and the euro is because after 9/11, with the introduction of the Patriot Act, the Italian organized crime really started to play a big role in this activity. I know that also the Russian organized crimes and the Balkan organized crime did play a role, but the leading role definitely has been the Italian organized crime. So the euro was a great currency because it had been introduced in 2001. It was a currency that could circulate freely in a very large territory with a high number of population, and it was a fantastic opportunity.
Talking about like the European Union, there are now talks or proposals are like from the European Commission to fight money laundering and also like to fight even more terrorist financing. There are talks about establishing like an own authority and also like reducing the leeway for member states in regard to the implementation of EU regulations. Is this like a first good step into the right direction?
Yeah, I mean, I think any of those initiatives are quite good, but I mean, the real problem is the fact that we don't have in Europe a legislation like the one that there is in the US, applied to the dollar, so the Patriot Act. Not that the legislation is particularly good, but in terms of money laundering, it's actually quite good legislation. Now, one of the reasons why you cannot introduce anything like that in Europe is that, although we do have a common currency, we do not have one single authority. So is it the federal government in the US can introduce a legislation which is applied everywhere? We can't do that. So, although the legislation, I say any money laundering legislation needs to be approved by all the members of the European Union, then each country needs to ratify. So if a country decides not to ratify, if the parliament of one of these countries decides not to ratify, that legislation doesn't get in place. So that is the difficulties to conduct a proper money laundering in Europe and in Europe. You have too many loopholes. And then the other thing is that most of the money, you must remember, moves in cash. So although it's very difficult today to deposit cash in the banking system without proof of origins, you can still buy property somewhere in cash. So I think we are still very far from really blocking that kind of activity.
Mm, What should be done more precisely, more effective to fight terrorist financing, like maybe like in Europe, like in the United States, in your opinion?
Well, I mean, we should integrate Europe in the right way, which is impossible. Look, we can't even get to do euro bonds because of the coronavirus. I mean, you got to have a fiscal policy, you have to have a monetary policy, you have to have integration, and you have to have one authority which has the power to impose a legislation everywhere. I don't think it's, I mean, you will need the Federal Union of Europe. I mean, similar to the US or also Australia. Australia is another country, very similar, but I don't see this happening. So I think for the time being, the money laundering in Euro will continue to be extremely attractive.
Also, you talked in one of your books was about this topic, like about rogue economies. So it's not specifically about terrorist activities, it's about illegal activities, also black markets, but you can describe it. And of course, and you said also one consequence for the rise of rogue economies, like we saw it in 1929, like already like in the Roman Empire, like within the Industrial Revolution, was globalization, one root, so to say. Do you think now with the coronavirus going on, like on a global level, and like the globalization as we know it being very much in question to a certain extent, do you think like the rogue economy is going to be reduced to a certain extent, or it's going to rise because of this uncertain, unstable situation, like in political, also like in economic terms?
I mean, what I said in the book was that the process of globalization was creating big injustices and also disequilibria. But what I said is that, in the long run, actually, the globalization, if it works, is going to be positive. So it's going to redesign the world economy in a more modern and also equitable place, because people will demand more. I mean, it's not necessarily negative globalization. It can be very positive, providing it's handled in the right way. Now, we haven't handled it in the right way, I'm afraid. But what I'm seeing now is a process of globalization. So, we're backtracking. And I think this it could be negative, as it was negative in the 1930s. Protectionism. In fact, I do use that example in the book. I fear that because of the coronavirus will become a sort of excuse to close the border. I mean, you already see now, for example, that Schengen has been suspended. This country, the United States, is closed completely. I mean, we are at 80 kilometers from the Canadian border. Canadian border has been closed for a month and a half, and there is no way it's going to be reopened for the time being. So you see, how is this necessary? Actually, no, it is not necessary. Meaning, on the other side of the border, there is a very low contagion. You can still leave the border open and check people coming in and coming out, but the temptation is that let's use this as an excuse to do something that we wanted to do and we couldn't do, which is close down the economies. That's happening in the US. I see this happening more or less everywhere. Maybe the United Kingdom is the only country that still maintains that kind of openness. But I think in Europe there is this tendency, and that's super dangerous. It's absolutely super dangerous because we now have economies that are so interdependent and interlinked that shutting down suddenly this linkage is only going to create huge problems. We'll have shortages. We'll also have, spikes of unemployment. So, and finally, this anti-Chinese sentiment is another dangerous development. So the Chinese now are blamed because they create the viruses, which is absolutely not true. They are the one who spread the virus. They are the one that didn't do what he was supposed to do. This kind of narrative is not good at all. And it's not good in particular in times like this, in which people need to maintain cohesion instead of promoting division.
Unfortunately, we're running out of time. It was very interesting to talk with you about like different aspects of terrorist financing and also like the impacts of the coronavirus crisis. Thank you very much, Loretta Napoleoni, for the interview. And I hope that we can talk in the future again. And all the best to you in Montana and the United States.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.
Okay, bye. Bye-bye.